This is the last session of two really big days of ideas and inspiration, and appropriately for a conference with future in the title, we're thinking about how to get to next. I kept putting a question mark on this, and then I realised that there was no question mark on the title. So the program's promised you an experienced change makers look at the challenges of organisations that are aware of the need for change but struggle to make headway in this turbulent period for financial, infrastructural and cultural reasons. So we've got an hour together. We'll explore a few ideas amongst us, and then again I'll be looking at the Slido. And again, I've had an opportunity, in fact, to have lunch with these three people, as well as speaking to each of them individually. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves again. I will once again acknowledge that we are meeting on Indigenous land that was never ceded, and express my gratitude for the opportunity to live and work in this particular place, and acknowledge and pay my respects to any First Nations people who might be present. I would like us to really broadly explore the theme of infrastructure, and to do so as relationships, which I think is a really nice continuity from the last panel, but also as governance and funding on policy. So, as I said a second ago, I will ask everybody to kind of introduce themselves, but I'm going to ask them to do it in relation to the topic and in response to an observation by a keynote speaker from last year, Deb Chatra. So those of you who are lucky enough to be here last year, she opened the conference talking at a very high level about her work and her book, How Infrastructure Works, Transforming Our Shared Systems for a Changing World. So bear with me for a second. She has a chapter in the book called Infrastructure as Agency, and she says the hyperobjects that are our collective infrastructural systems shape not just what we actually do day after day as individuals and as communities, but even the possibilities for what we can consider doing. The cost of not being able to rely on previously reliable systems is unthinkably high. To have had well-functioning infrastructural systems and then to lose them is recognisably dystopian, which means that we can't live without them as they are. But here's the thing. We have everything we need to create a different world for everyone. It is possible to transform and rebuild our collective infrastructural systems to be functional and also resilient and sustainable. This gives us an unprecedented opportunity to rethink them for the coming century, instead of being defined by the previous ones. That includes recognising the fundamental injustices built into those systems, from the neighbourhood to the planetary level, and redressing them. 50 years ago, transforming these systems would have been an intractable engineering problem, but no longer. Today, the challenges we face are largely social and mostly boil down to this: how do we work together to transform these collective systems? Because the one thing we do know is that these shared systems that shape our lives, both affording and constraining the ways in which we do things, can't be shaped by individual actions alone. I have shared this with the panel in advance, so I'm not springing it on you. That would be cruel. But I would like each of you just to spend a little bit of time introducing yourself and share your initial response to that question of how we work together to transform these collective systems. Kate, would you like to begin?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kate Larsen. I'm an independent arts, cultural and non-profit consultant and writer. My bio's in the program. You can read more about that there. I grew up on Menang Noongar Budja in southwest Western Australia. I've lived and worked in all states and territories of Australia as well as Asia and the UK. What's not in my bio is that vast proportion of my creative practice has been as a digital and social media poet over the last several years. So it's interesting and a bit uncomfortable to have found myself in the last year as a digital evangelist who has somehow become a bit of a digital naysayer, specifically around the issue of generative AI. Though that is perhaps also unsurprising, given that a lot of my work is at the intersection of arts and human rights advocacy. These days, I feel like I'm almost a full-time governance nerd and rabble-rouser. So I'll respond to Deb's quote with that lens. She talks about the cost of not being able to rely on previous reliable systems is unthinkably high, which I agree with, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that our governance models and legislation were actually already unfit for purpose and are now woefully out of date. In the first place, they're built on capitalist and colonialist and military structures that are actually antithetical to most of our work, certainly in the for-purpose sector. And we've developed all of this learned practice around it that has created a gap between what we think we need to do, what our organisations need us to do, and what the legislation technically requires, which means that a lot of that learnt practice is actually, that keeps us so busy, is actually completely optional. I think in addition to that previously unreliable system, in the cultural change that has come since the pandemic, a lot of our other long-standing problems have come into really sharp relief now that we're all governing through a polycrisis, which means we have fewer people making bigger decisions in much harder circumstances. Whereas I agree with Deb that we have everything we need to create a different world, and in fact our sector is uniquely placed to have that bring that creativity and imagination to play in the dark, to work ourselves into new ways of being and working. We can only do that if we stop spinning our wheels on that unnecessary busy work that we think we need to do, when it's never been what we need, but it's certainly not what we need any longer. So not only is this an unprecedented opportunity to rethink for the coming century, as Deb says, I think there is a deep responsibility and duty of care for us to do so. And even when meeting that duty might require us to work in radically different ways to we are right now.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to Sam just because it's something different.
Thank you, Sophie. A great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. Yes, Sam Cairnduff, really nice to be here. And thank you, Seb, for the invitation. I live and am based here in Naarm, Melbourne, and like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people and the great privilege of being able to talk about these topics of culture on lands where culture has been practiced for millennia before us. I'm originally from Lutruwita, Nipaluna, on the lands of the Muanina people, but have been here for a little while. My background is sort of a varied career. I started out as a musician, which took me to London, and worked for a while there as a theatre producer and in arts and cultural communications and artist management. Came back to Australia in 2016 and took up the role of Director of Marketing and Communications at the Tasmanian Symphony Orchestra. And while I was there, I think I started to observe some of the things that we're talking about today. I guess some of those infrastructural paradoxes sometimes, tensions, whatever you want to call it. And that sort of, I guess, piqued my interest in looking at the systems of cultural institutions and their place in particularly contemporary Australian society. And that led me into further research, doing a PhD. And now I sort of have found myself working in academia for the last 4 years. And I'm thrilled to be lecturing at the University of Melbourne and RMIT in topics of arts and cultural management, creative and cultural industries, and cultural communications. I just love that area. But my interest is passionately, I guess, in the role of culture in contemporary society, and further to that, the role of cultural institutions in contemporary society, and how that role might have changed. And I guess where the question really arose for me was this idea of cultural leadership. And if anyone's seen any of my work, I write a lot about cultural leadership. I have a podcast called Decoding Cultural Leadership. And I got that interested in that idea of cultural leadership from the fact that this term was being used prolifically in articulated strategy documents, like annual reports, strategic plans, cultural institutions, we are cultural leaders. And I thought, what does it actually mean? Is it about art form or is it about some sort of broader social role? And that started my research into orchestras and particularly, their social role. And what I found is a lot of organisations actually couldn't answer that question, or they had multiple different answers for it, multiple different interpretations, which is nothing wrong with that, but I found that really interesting. So I guess coming back to Deb's point about infrastructure, absolutely, cultural institutions by necessity, because they receive public money and they have to operate as organised entities, and particularly we've seen with the increasing corporatisation of cultural institutions, they are forms of infrastructure. But cultural infrastructure creates different kinds of value. It creates different kinds of meaning, symbolic meaning, and it deals with lots of intangibles: imagination, creativity, inspiration, collaboration, and that's where I think some of the complexity comes in. But also, obviously, we heard about joy in the last panel, so I would agree with that too. But where I think we're at the moment is a problematic place, and I've written a lot about this in the last year, where we've seen institutional failures in times of crisis, or crises coming out of particular tensions or social pressures, particularly sparking around, the war in Gaza at the moment has been such a flashpoint because it's divided stakeholders of these organisations. So we've actually seen infrastructural models collapse and value of these organisations go away or fall away. So I think if we think about the nature of infrastructure and how infrastructure evolves, and if we're looking towards change, we might think back to Foucault and governmentality or institutional theory, where we see institutional norms develop and embed and become more reinforced over the years without actually being questioned. And I think that's the point we're at. So I guess for me, the bottom line of this conversation is I think that we need a fundamental reevaluation of the role of culture in Australian society and contemporary society, and more to that, the role of cultural institutions in performing and contributing to that role. So I think that's sort of where my thinking is around that particular point.
Small ask, Sam. Nick.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Pickard. I'm head up government relations and public affairs at APRA AMCOS, which is a big cultural institution. We represent 128,000 songwriters, composers, music publishers across Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific. In a previous life, I studied theatre directing at the Academy of Theatre in Ljubljana, Slovenia, and came back to Australia trying to get funding, trying to get space, trying to put on shows, and got really frustrated with what was going on here. What's the cultural policy here? What's the funding? And I started a blog called Sydney Arts Journo back when, this is the pre-podcast days. And kind of at the same, just after Alison Croggan started Theatre Notes, started writing reviews and started writing policy pieces and sort of trying to uncover what was going on. And then fell into journalism and then got invited to be the advisor to the New South Wales Minister for the Arts a few years later. So I didn't have a political background, but then fell into politics and cultural policy, and then worked for Simon Crean in Canberra on the National Cultural Policy. Fast forward to today, I've been at APRA for about 8 years, and prior to that, copyright agency. So in the copyright world for about 10 years. We've had some big fights over the last few years. Really 2019, 2020, somebody mentioned those bushfires that happened across most of Australia. And that's when we started, so many of our members, particularly in the south coast of New South Wales, the Gippsland region of Victoria, South Australia, southern Queensland, were affected. A lot of venues were closed, and we started what we called herding the cats, bringing those parts of the music ecology together and start talking to each other, start sharing information, and that's kind of an old system of bringing people together to provide a platform to voice their concerns, voice their beliefs, and provide a sharing space for information and knowledge. Then COVID happened, and really that's when it really kicked off and we started collaborating a lot. And then most recently AI. So it's almost like asteroids are coming at our industry from all sorts of directions. And really the thing that I think we always forget is that our sector has a huge amount of social capital. The value that we have across the community, whether it's the way that kids are, learning, whether it's the entertainment at a local pub, whether it's the movies you go to, whether it's the galleries you attend, whether it's those, bringing community together. We have a huge amount of social capital. And the key really is, how do you turn that into political capital? And that's a lot of the work that I do at ACMI in partnership with the broader arts and cultural sector. So that's really, it's bringing those sort of older, trusted forms of coming together and then really translating that and making sure that you're telling your story to whoever will listen. And that means, opposition, government, crossbenchers, even in a really polarised political environment.
Yeah. And Nick, you've kind of, again, come at this from a very interesting perspective, because I think you've used the infrastructure and to a degree subverted it through these kind of relational groups. But you talk about the need to be kind of aligned on principles, not necessarily on politics. And I think there's something really interesting in that as we kind of struggle to articulate who we are and why we matter. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, how you've applied that approach and the success that has brought.
Yeah, probably the two most recent examples are really bringing the music industry together to create an ask of the federal government in a kind of vote music campaign, and getting all the parts of the industry together. So that's the live sector, the recording sector. We represent songwriters and composers, so the musical works, but also festivals, also music educators, and getting those different parties to really distill what is it that's going to turn the dial for your industry and for the people that work in your industry within the next term of government and perhaps the one after that. So what's that 3 to 5 year look like? So if you can really distill that down, around the music campaign, we really distilled that down to, this is in 2022, so in the lead up to the consultation of the National Cultural Policy, we wanted a National Music Development Office. We wanted to fix regulation around local content obligations. That's on both the video on demand side and broadcast and audio streaming. And we also wanted a tax offset for live music to really try and build some sustainability with the industry. And we framed that really in a really positive way. If you partner with the music industry, imagine what we can do together with government, turn Australia from a music, a nation of music into a music powerhouse. Really talking up that opportunity of co-investment strategies with our industry. The other example is really the AI and music, the artificial intelligence campaign. And when that really hit, that really started off in 2022 when particularly photographers and illustrators started to see their work being copied. And I started to see this starting to ping on media platforms and in various articles. And then it wasn't much longer that, there was the Books 3 case where suddenly authors, everyone from Thomas Keneally through to, Tim Winton and, poets and are starting to see their works caught up in the database that's been used by the large language models in the Atlantic. And so I rang, colleagues at the Australian Society of Authors, National Association of Visual Arts, anyone that has intellectual property within the creative sector. I think it's time to get the band back together again, because we'd faced this 10 years prior when the big tech platforms last tried to astroturf their way into policy making in Australia to try and overhaul Australia's copyright regime. So bringing those people together and, basic conversations, just like it's time to meet, organise a meeting. And that's often all it takes really, is to get a meeting, a conversation started. What's going on with your membership? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What do we want out of that? And that's where we came up with the consent credit, and compensation. Those three words which could be repeated ad nauseum, whether you're a visual artist, whether you're a poet, whether you're a lyricist, whether you're a filmmaker. I want credit, I want consent for my IP, and if you're going to use it, I want compensation. So that really sort of started the whole, campaign around artificial intelligence, so that we could all share that journey, regardless of who we were talking, whether it was, politicians or representatives in WA and the Northern Territory, or Sydney, Melbourne, or Canberra.
And that kind of that constant convening of relationships. And I think there's also something in the way that you approach that, which is, at the time when we're being told that there is no alternative, you said, yes, there is, and found people who also agreed that yes, there was, and kind of there was a lot of momentum and power in the ability to go, there is an alternative to this, and this is how we would like to shape it.
Yeah, and one of the keys to that was we didn't want to come across as a sector that was saying no to AI. We didn't want to be, because what that would have done is opened ourselves up to the tech sector as basically being Luddites and anti-technology. So I started collaborating with, because AI obviously global, this is a global policy challenge, started talking to particularly colleagues in France and Germany whose governments were basically standing back from voting for a really important AI Act in the European Union. And they partnered together and commissioned research to look at what the economic impact of artificial intelligence would be on the music industry, but also to survey their members and find out, what was the level of engagement of their members, so songwriters and composers in Germany and France, around artificial intelligence. And that report was really instrumental in helping get the German and French governments to, really just come in and vote for that legislation. So I commissioned the same researchers out of Berlin, and we did the same report. The only difference that I did was I added in Indigenous cultural intellectual property. So really for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members and our Maori members, really trying to uncover what the impact of AI was to those art forms and those artists and those communities. The thing that really came out of it, and this is from August 2024, so we're, it's nearly 2 years away, 2 years ago, was that 34% of our members had already started using AI in their creative practice. The majority, the biggest cohort was those between the ages of 40 and 54. It was about 45%. And we had about 4,500 of our members respond to that survey. And I mean, we don't get responses from our members about much. And they responded, like, it was quite overwhelming how much and how quickly they're responding just in a matter of weeks. Yeah. So we got a really good snapshot on what was going on. It meant that we could go to camera and say, look, we're not Luddites. The music industry has embraced technology. Somebody was talking about the synthesizer before, embraced technology. Artists have embraced technology for, millennia. This is no different. What we demand is a sustainable environment for that to happen and for our intellectual property to be respected.
Yeah. And Kate, speaking of there is no alternative, you have been, I think, instrumental in thinking about and working with organisations on alternative models for how they operate and how they understand themselves. And I'm wondering if you could share some of that, because I do think at the same time as there's this kind of, advocacy has never been more important, which certainly, Nick's speaking to operating very successfully with the infrastructure that we do have. There is a strong sense that we do need new ways of governing and understanding ourselves as arts organisations.
Yeah, and I think the first and most important part of that equation is that we actually have more flexibility to explore new models than we think we might have, because when so much of our common practice governance or learnt so-called best practice is entirely optional, we have the opportunity to stop doing it and to buy ourselves the time to do this bigger picture thinking, in spite of the fact, and it's completely understandable that we don't, that we aren't making the time right now. We are all governing through a polycrisis. It is exponentially more difficult year on year to run and sustain organisations with increasingly more burnt out people. So I can, with grace, understand how so many, as Sam was saying, organisations are now, arts organisations are making mainstream headlines for high-profile governance failures, most of which are completely avoidable and most of which could have been, if not completely avoided, then mitigated with a little more relationality for remembering who to listen to, remembering to hold their purpose at the heart of their decision-making processes, even when they're rushed and panicked in making those decisions. So with grace, we can understand how we're in the middle of this perfect storm, but we also have the tools and the ability to change it. And even though that's hard, we are seeing some really exciting emergent practices happening around Australia. As usual, we're a little bit behind some of our colleagues overseas. There's some really interesting work coming out of Canada, and there's a lot coming out of Seattle. Weird, I don't know what's going on in Seattle. But even here in Australia, we're seeing, just in the last couple of years, as just to provide an infrastructure example, we're seeing more organisations, new organisations, incorporating as companies limited by shares instead of companies limited by guarantee or incorporated associations. And that's radical because they can have one board member. Though, as an aside, actually, if you have an incorporated association in Victoria, the legislation only says one board member as well. Just nobody knows that. And I'm not saying that I want our organisations to be run by a single person. What it opens up is the opportunity to separate governance from a common practice board, because those boards are being asked to do too much in increasingly complex and difficult circumstances, and they were failing already, and they're failing more deeply now and causing more and deeper and more longer term harm, in spite of their best intentions. There are good humans being broken by a broken model. But what's really exciting is these organisations that are shrinking down to what they need, what the legislation requires of them, allows them to think more broadly about a bigger definition of governance. So who are the decision makers, not just who's at the table, but do we need a table? Like, how do we go out to if our purpose is to serve an art form or artists or audiences, how are those people informing our decision making? And we're seeing some really wonderful little models. So boards that are throwing out the completely optional and colonial Robert Rules of Order where the boardrooms sit around and they put motions and second motions and vote. None of that is necessary. And it's so alienating and makes so many of those spaces culturally unsafe. Instead, beautiful examples of youth arts organisations taking board members into rehearsal rooms and putting on pizza and asking young people questions, and the quality of their governance just being revolutionised as a result. So I think it takes a bit of bravery to unlearn all we've been taught about governance, and it takes a bit of energy at a time when none of us have any to spare. But it can be, I think, a really exciting trigger to acknowledge that this model not only doesn't work for us, but doesn't have to work for us. Yeah. We can take it back to the basics, and we can design something that not only serves us better now, but it's going to serve us better in the future. Yeah. And there's a question from the audience here that is the perfect segue to you, Sam, from exactly that point, which is there seems to be such a huge divide between board members and their understanding of the arts that they represent. I would also say often of the organisations that they represent. And, how do we fix that gap? And you've got a kind of model that we've spoken about, is sort of your 3 principles about realigning, not just with purpose, but also with the people in your organisation. I wonder if you could just share that as a way of framing one possibility of fixing the gap.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, I think the point is very valid, that the gap between the board members and the organisation itself, because the corporatisation of particularly the major arts organisations in Australia, means that they're having multiple revenue streams, some government subsidy, earn revenue through ticket sales and collaborations and other things. They might do commercial work sometimes. And then, of course, this idea of philanthropy. And then we're overlaying this with this corporatised idea that they have to have a board, and that board is not paid. That's a volunteer board. And naturally, a lot of organisations are going to drift towards recruiting board members who might be connected to certain corporate sectors or bring some sort of expertise. And their relationship to the art form might be as a patron, as a punter, but not necessarily as someone who understands the dynamics and the complexity of cultural institutions, because they're not like running a bank or an insurance company or a medical practice. They're very, very different, with all kinds of different drivers and pressure points. So I think that's an interesting point. My colleague Kim Goodwin often talks very, very broadly about the idea of we need more artists on boards. We need more creative representation on boards, and that happens sometimes in a kind of almost a tokenistic way. An orchestra will have the musician on the board or the young person on the board or whatever it might be, but is it really embedding into their kind of their overall governance decision making? The model thank you for mentioning that, Sophie, is that in my research into cultural organisations and what I talked about before, understanding their social role, how do they actually function, I did come up with a bit of a model that was basically touching on some things that are already existing, I guess, in corporate or strategic culture. And the overarching thing, we talk a lot about values practices and values exercises, and it's become a kind of a governance tick box that we've got to do our values workshops and consult people and sit down and distill the values. And I saw this happen in a few organisations, and most of them come out with some version of integrity, communication, breathing, walking, these kind of fundamental human practices. To me, they're not really meaningful to the organisation about, exactly talking about where we are, what we actually mean in that sort of environment in which we're existing, in the context in which we're operating. So I talked about an idea of purpose or understanding actual purpose of the organisation. And that comes from what I found in my research is often cultural organisations, particularly, I guess, heritage arts organisations or some of the majors, might have a kind of not a confusion, but this sort of obfuscation within the organisation is, we're a theatre company, we make theatre. We're an orchestra, we play classical music, orchestral music. Or we're an opera company, we perform opera. That's their function. My question is, what is your purpose? What's the purpose of a symphony orchestra that's based in Darwin? It's going to be very different from a symphony orchestra, the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, or a community orchestra in Adelaide, or whatever it might be. And it's depending on, I guess, the stakeholder environment, the context of that organisation, thinking about the social context, the cultural context in which it operates, the contemporary context. What does it mean to perform this art form or to create this artistic practice at this particular point in time? And I think that's a conversation that a lot of organisations just don't have. And they get this idea of function and purpose, and then we get these silly kind of debates when things go awry, when people say, well, we just go to the orchestra to hear music. We don't go to hear political opinions or to be challenged about social change and that kind of thing. Whereas I would argue, well, that's the fundamental role of any cultural organisation, is to contribute to social transformation, social progress, discourse, all the things that, all those great works were written for originally. Just because we're performing it in 2026 in Australia doesn't mean it's just a sort of a performance piece, or it becomes entertainment or leisure. This is a tension. So harmonising purpose is the kind of the linchpin of the three. The other I called authentic social. What is it called? Authentic social participation. And this, I guess, is a response to the fact that we often talk about this idea of engagement. Engagement's become one of those buzzwords. About, we want to engage with our audiences and want them to engage with us. I'm actually talking about participation in a more visceral level, contributing to the development and the shifting social fabrics in which we operate. And I guess that's where I see the fundamental role of arts and cultural institutions. So that idea, again, it's contextual. It's going to be very much dependent on where the organisation is situated, the kinds of challenges that it faces. And I think I would argue that if you have a really good understanding of purpose, then your ability to participate in that society or that social context is going to be deeper and more authentic. Authenticity is an overused buzzword, but I didn't find a more appropriate word. And the third is just around, again, creating stakeholder value, but meaningful stakeholder value, and understanding, first of all, who our stakeholders actually are. And once again, stakeholders is a strategic term that we hear a lot, but having a really deep and contextual understanding. So, none of these are rocket science. It's really about understanding who we are, where we are, who the people are that we're serving, and then using that, deep understanding, more than just a strategic tick box, to inform our practice of cultural leadership or our practice of being present in that society and contributing meaningfully to it.
Yeah. That's the stepping back from performance, which is similar to the governance thing. It's stepping back from the orthodoxy of this is what we've always done, and having those moments of really critical thinking. And one of the things we've talked about is the difference between, I suppose the time-bound idea of purpose as well and governance. And we were talking, Sam, about, in perpetuity is not possible for any purpose. So how are we reframing, how long our purpose is valent for, and what does that look like?
And that's really true, because organisations are dynamic, cultural organisations are dynamic, and the society in which we're operating is incredibly dynamic too. And you've only got to look at the kinds of issues and the kinds of discourse that we have around, shifting attitudes towards all kinds of things in our society: gender, First Nations, our relationships with First Nations peoples, our understanding of the multicultural society in which we live. And these things have shifted even in, 5-10 years. And organisations and cultural organisations should be kind of at the forefront of that, I think. And that's the idea that it's got to be dynamic, it's got to be evolving. So this idea of, a value statement that's going to be, fixed in stone in perpetuity is not relevant, because we're dynamic. I think we were talking before, Sophie, about the expectations of audiences, of consumers, of society towards all organisations has shifted in the last 20 years. That we expect organisations with whom we transact, whether it's a bank or a supermarket or an insurance company, to articulate some form of social values. And we were talking before about how deep that runs, and it's not necessarily running that deep necessarily, always, but we look to that. And the turning point for me, I think, was with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra and the marriage equality plebiscite of 2017. When the Sydney Symphony Orchestra said, the plebiscite is about to happen, but we're not going to make a statement. We're going to remain neutral on this because that's not our social role. Audiences, stakeholders, the general public said, well, hang on a minute. No, we expect you to have a stake in this. And they very rapidly turned around. We talked about this, Esther, on the podcast, didn't we? Turned around and made a statement in the affirmative. And that to me was a signal that maybe that question wouldn't have been asked 20 years ago. I don't know. But it means certainly that society is dynamic, and the organisations and the infrastructure needs to be dynamic as well.
Yeah. Can I just jump in on that? Just made me think back to Deb's quote about the inadequate tools, or the tools that have become inadequate, because every single incorporated association and company, arts organisation in this country has objects of association, objects in their constitution or governing rules. They are having a vision and the mission and the purpose and values, de rigueur, strategic planning language. What the last couple of years of the increasing authoritarianism being matched by increasing censorship and organisational governance failures as they fumble their way through these issues has revealed so many organisational hypocrisies in that these lovely, worthy words are just that on paper, and are not being incorporated or embedded into decision-making and certainly into risk and crisis management at all levels, from tiny little organisations to our national peak bodies who purport to serve artistic expression on the one hand and censor artists on the other. And again, perfect storm. Understandable how these things happen, but when we don't hold that centre, and when we lose track of who it is we should be listening to in times of crisis. So is it the loudest voice, even if that's not from the largest group or the group who is closest to our purpose? That's where we're seeing those organisations drop the ball.
Just quickly,
Yes, Nick.
add a little bit on that. I was just thinking about the governance limitations, and I'd also just add in there the limitations of certain government regulations on particularly the contemporary music industry. We have a crazy situation where the free trade agreement that Australia signed with the US back in the Howard era basically put a limit on how much we could regulate, how much culture we put in front of Australians. I mean, the situation is so insane that for the current government to put through any sort of regulations was a really tricky political act for the obligations on the streaming video on demand services. I mean, just yesterday, the Commercial Radio Association got their new code signed off by ACMI, which basically said, we're not going to really change the obligations on the radio stations to play Australian music. And we've now got this really bit of a crazy situation where we have to boomerang our culture for institutions in Australia to go, oh, okay, well, maybe we can play that to Australian audiences. And that's a really, that's the sort of that cringe element coming in that is sort of backed in by an extraordinary governance around, at a federal level.
So change is required. Yes. Get that band back together again?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely it's on the whiteboard.
It's on the whiteboard. One of the things we were talking about over lunch was funding and policy as infrastructure, and I think this policy is, as infrastructure is one of the things that we need to change. Nick, you were really interesting on this because you talk about investment, not funding, very explicitly and purposefully. And I'm just wondering if you could sort of unpack that a little bit for the audience in terms of reframing, again, this what feels like a kind of monolithic infrastructure that's been set up, for a world that no longer exists in terms of how we're funded, and what flipping that into the investment kind of framework begins to do.
Yeah, I'm pretty passionate about this. Whenever I see, colleagues in the arts sectors sort of campaigning and advocating, obviously in Victoria at the moment there's really big funding issues that are facing a lot of organisations, and often the immediate reaction is to go save us. And I honestly, I've not seen that ever work in a campaign for our sector ever. I don't know why we keep doing it. And that's why we always talk about the campaign for the music industry and for musicians, always in the positive and always surrounded by opportunity. That's, so when we sort of come together, whenever we sort of setting those principles up, we always talk about investment. We always talk about what the opportunity of, co-investment is. One of the things that we're advocating for at the moment is around a tax rebate for live music, because we know that, venues have got a lot of problems being sustainable. They've got a lot of problems, particularly in jurisdictions like New South Wales. We've got poker machines that are sort of lifting up venues, and you've got changing consumer behaviour where kids are going out to see live music, but they're not spending as much because they're not drinking as much. So all of the economics around live music and the associated parts of our industry are really starting to shift quite a lot. So the opportunity that we, talk about with state government, local government, and the federal government is, talking about the multiplier effect of investing or changing regulation or doing X, Y, and Z, because then you will unlock, investment in local communities. You will be able to enhance the nighttime economy of a regional centre. You'll be able to encourage visitor economy. You'll be able to create social cohesion. You'll be able to, so always trying to find And that's what I was alluding to before, is that we have massive social capital. So you might as well talk about the investment opportunities in our industry because of the multiplier effect that'll have across the community. There's often, obviously schools of thought, arts for art's sake, which is completely legitimate. But I tend to go into advocacy, and that's talking to Libs, Nats, ALP, Teals. I mean, I live on the Northern Beaches, so we're sort of like the teal, centre of Australia at the moment. We really, try and talk about what the opportunity of that investment is, and what that's going to mean for their electorate and their community. And that for me is the obvious way to exploit that social capital to turn it into political, because the save us mentality, that's not creating any political capital.
No, and I think certainly I've experienced in some of the work I've been doing here in the kind of on the edges of policy has been this idea that, in fact, as I was talking to boards of particularly small to medium sector organisations, they could not conceive of the idea that the government wasn't going to come to their rescue, even as the government has been quite proactively and not explicitly, unfortunately. It would be great if there could be some kind of explicit way of saying we're not going to do this, but has been, seeding and indicating for quite some time that this is not going to continue. There's a kind of lack of, there's a cruelty in that lack of clarity. Bringing back that idea of, in good grace, we understand why, but it's not doing us any favours. And so, and certainly having, talking to you guys about this panel, in relation to the panel previously, I also was thinking about those kind of ecological practices around, do we need to do things forever? What is the value of kind of time-boundness in the way that we think about ourselves and the infrastructures that we create? Because it feels like we're stuck with an infrastructure that we've had for 100, 150 years. Maybe we should have been thinking about how do we actually end our infrastructures so that new infrastructures can come up as well, or how we're thinking about what we need to change and evolve in a more kind of future-focused kind of way.
Yeah.
I don't have any answers. No.
I think COVID was a good test of that too, and I think about the orchestral context. Again, I come back to orchestras because that was sort of where I started. But you've got, from an ecological perspective, and I mean, it doesn't make sense to me anyway from a kind of a practical perspective, but you're flying conductors in from Western Europe, from America, from Asia, not developing an ecosystem of Australian conductors because we've still got this sort of cultural cringe mentality about they have to come from Central Europe. I mean, no one actually in the audience really knows who they are, but they fly them in to these concerts, and the musicians get excited about it, and that's about it. I'm not denigrating that at all, because there's value in that too. But flying them in and then flying them back again, COVID immediately for many performing arts organisations, obviously they couldn't perform, they couldn't do their sort of, I guess, their primary function, and then they actually had to ask that question about purpose. And the orchestra that I was involved with actually sort of reframed itself as being, well, how do we serve our community when we can't perform our core function? And it was all about maybe familiarising the audiences more through digital forms with the actual musicians, developing their personalities and their relationships, giving people an opportunity to do things like conducting in small socially distanced ensembles. And it actually was a really valuable exercise for that piece of infrastructure. But of course, when all the restrictions were lifted, what happened? Everything went back to the way it was. And that was frustrating too.
It is frustrating. We've got 5 minutes. I know it says we've got 10 minutes, but we started 5 minutes late. There are a load of questions here. Kate, you are going to get hit up so hard by the audience around all the technicalities of ACNC requirements and GTR status and all sorts of other things. But I'll let you... Kate, who will graciously answer all of your questions. After this panel, you may need to buy her a beverage. But as we wrap up, I'm thinking about, this is a future-oriented conversation. What is the change that you see happening in infrastructure, or what is the change that you think is most needed that we should be stepping into next? And I'd ask each of you to kind of respond to that. Sorry, you're right next.
No, it's fine. The change that I see happening, the change that I want to happen, are not the same things.
No.
I think we are at an incredible tipping point. I think we are learning the wrong lessons. I think every organisation that's making headlines for governance failures and failures of purpose and betrayal of their purpose and constituencies, each is worse because they're failing to learn the lessons of those who have failed before them. These things that are being lost are not so easily repaired. Yeah. We were already losing people from our sector before the pandemic, and that has accelerated. They are now not being replaced at anywhere near the same rate. So we're risking an entire generation of artists and arts organisations. Again, that's not saying that I'm not at all saying that we should be focusing on the self-perpetuation cycle. I think we do need to end better, but both of those conversations need to happen at the same time. When there's so much going on at the moment that is outside of our control, the tolerance for the unnecessary that we have the power to change has just evaporated. And I think we need to, as Jen Ray was saying, that difference between nihilism and activism, this is not going to get better unless we make it get better, and it won't get better without us. So I guess that's the change that I want to see happen, is that we are all exhausted and bludgeoned, and understandably so, but I would like to see us all come together and share that energy and find those solutions together.
Okay. Nick?
I just want to acknowledge the crisis that's going on in arts education, whether it's primary, high school or university sector. It is an absolute crisis. And that's not just about the next generation of artists, that's about the next generation of audiences. And I think that that's something that should be uniting all of us in the lead up to the next election, in the next consultation for the National Cultural Policy. I think it should be front and centre of all of us. But the thing that I wanted to say though was, don't really, dig into that creativity that's inherent within our sector. Don't be afraid of the dead cat strategy. And by that I mean change the conversation. A year into COVID, I managed to get our chair, Jenny Morris, to do a National Press Club address. We didn't talk about COVID. We didn't talk about the fact that our entire industry had shut down. We didn't talk about any of that. What we did was we talked about where do we want the music industry to be in 10 years' time, and we set an ambition for us to be a net exporter of music. So it's about changing that conversation and surprising people and really setting the narrative of what you want your industry to be and our sector to be. So that's what I would say.
Great, thank you, Sam.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we need to look at some of the crises that have happened in the last 3 years as evidence that we're kind of in an existential crisis overall with the industry, and we're not learning. And it's causing us to, and I say we, I mean, I'm talking about the organisations themselves and the environment in which they're operating. I think what needs to happen is a fundamental reevaluation of the role of culture and cultural institutions in contemporary Australian society, recognising that we're living in a privileged society, that we're privileged to have these organisations, contrasting with many places in the world like Iran, where this kind of cultural expression that we're privileged to have is not possible. And I think we need to have that discussion and build our organisations really, or our understanding of the industry from the ground up with that understanding, so that we don't end up with writers' festivals where more than 50% of the writers walk away, or writers' festivals where we're censoring authors at a fucking writers' festival, where we're ending up with artists always losing out in these moments of crises, whether it's actors in the Sydney Theatre Company, Jason Gillum on stage at the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, the list goes on. I think we've got to look at this and just not pretend, situation normal. We've actually got a serious problem. So those questions need to be asked at a policy level, at an industry level, and our arm's length funding bodies like Creative Australia really need to be kind of at the centre of that conversation rather than part of the problem. So essentially, I think it's time to wake up and actually have those conversations, and then we start to rebuild the infrastructure, talking about what kind of value we create, how we create it, who our stakeholders, shareholders, constituents are, how we govern, how we advocate, how we do all those things that the cultural institutions can do so well, but really in a rebuilt understanding of what actual social role is. Because I really feel like no one can answer that at the moment. I feel like we're too busy putting out fires or talking about something else or trying to sort of get people to look somewhere else, that we actually ask that question. And I think it's time.
Yeah. Thank you. I think I feel like this conversation and the conversation previously, and indeed over the last couple of years, and as well as the last couple of days, we've all been experiencing a certain kind of dissonance, and we've realised that dissonance is actually not something that we can continue to tolerate. And Kate, when you and I were talking, we were sort of going through the conundrum of, well, how do we take time out to rethink and reevaluate? And I think over the course of, particularly the last 2 days, we've seen the value of, that we have a huge amount of authority and a huge amount of agency at our fingertips, even although it may not feel that way. But equally, we have that kind of opportunity to make the choice, and there's a choicefulness here around stepping aside and going, let's now take some time to fix the things that we know are not working, rather than worrying about them on an ongoing basis. And one of the things I love about FACT is that it is about the future, and it is about thinking about what is possible. And so I think you've given us the grounding for some of that, as has the panel previously and all the other panels. So I'm going to stop now and say thank you to all of you, and thank you to all of you, and hand over to Seb.